It was a quiet summer afternoon in a small suburban neighborhood, where the streets were lined with modest houses, each with a little patch of lawn. The sun was high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the peaceful scene. A light breeze swayed the trees, and the scent of fresh-cut grass filled the air. In the distance, children's laughter could be heard as they played in the streets, and the occasional car rolled by, its tires humming softly against the asphalt. On the corner of Maple and Pine, a weathered wooden table stood beneath the shade of a large oak tree. A sign, hastily written in thick black marker, read, "Lemonade, $1," in bold, hopeful letters. The table was simple but charming, with a pitcher of freshly squeezed lemonade and a few plastic cups neatly arranged. A basket of small change sat next to the pitcher, and a few paper napkins lay scattered around. At the center of the setup stood a young girl, no older than 10, her dark brown eyes filled with a mixture of determination and sadness. She wore a faded yellow dress, the kind that had seen better days, and her hair was pulled back into a messy ponytail. Her name was Emily, and this wasn't just a typical lemonade stand. It was a desperate attempt to raise money for something far more important than a simple childhood pastime. Emily was battling leukemia, a fight she had been engaged in for over a year. The doctors had told her parents that the treatment was expensive, and although Emily's mother worked 2 jobs to cover the costs, they were still falling short. The medical bills were stacking up, and Emily had overheard her parents talking late at night about how hard it was to make ends meet. That's when she decided to take matters into her own hands. She had no idea how much lemonade she would need to sell to make a dent in the medical expenses, but she figured every little bit helped. Her small hands worked tirelessly, filling cup after cup, each one poured with care and a touch of pride. Despite the weight of her situation, Emily had an air of quiet optimism about her. She smiled at each passerby, hoping that someone would stop, buy a cup, and help her reach her goal. The sun continued to beat down, but Emily didn't mind. She was used to the heat by now. She had learned to push through discomfort, whether it was the side effects of her treatments or the long days spent in the hospital waiting rooms. As she stood there, her eyes flickered to the street ahead, watching people stroll by, oblivious to her small but significant mission. Some people slowed down as they approached the stand, took a glance, and then kept walking. Others gave her a polite smile but didn't stop. Emily's shoulders sagged slightly, but she quickly straightened up, forcing a bright smile as the next person neared. She wasn't giving up. Not yet. Minutes turned to hours, and the afternoon heat showed no signs of letting up. Emily's throat was dry, her feet sore from standing in the same spot for so long, but she didn't complain. She simply kept pouring lemonade and offering it to anyone who would take a cup. In the back of her mind, she imagined her mother's face when they finally had enough money to pay for the next round of treatments. Maybe, just maybe, this small act of determination would make all the difference. It was then, just as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, that something unexpected happened. A car pulled up to the curb, and a figure stepped out, his silhouette tall and unmistakable. Elon Musk, the entrepreneur and philanthropist, was walking down the street. It wasn't the kind of place one would expect to see someone like him. Certainly not a celebrity billionaire, not in a quiet neighborhood like this. Yet, there he was, casually strolling down Maple Street, dressed in a simple black t-shirt and jeans. Emily barely noticed at first. She was focused on the few coins she was carefully arranging in her basket, her brow furrowed in concentration. But then, she felt it. A presence, something different in the air. Looking up, she saw the tall man standing just a few feet away, peering curiously at the lemonade stand. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. "You're selling lemonade?" he asked, his voice kind but tinged with a hint of amusement, as though he couldn't quite believe it himself. Emily nodded, swallowing hard before she spoke. "Yes, sir. I'm trying to raise money for my treatment. For my cancer." Elon's expression softened, his brow furrowing slightly as he processed her words. He took a step closer, glancing at the cups of lemonade, then back at her. There was something genuine in his eyes, a spark of compassion, perhaps, but also curiosity. He seemed to weigh the situation for a moment, as though deciding what to do next. "You're a very brave girl," he said softly, his tone more serious now. And I think you're doing something really important here. Emily smiled, though it was tinged with the quiet sadness of her reality. I'm trying, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I just want to help my mom. She's been working so hard, but it's not enough. Elon nodded, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer before he reached into his pocket. He pulled out a thick wad of cash and handed it to Emily without a second thought. Here, he said gently. This should cover more than a few cups of lemonade. Emily's eyes widened in disbelief as she took the money. She glanced down at the stack of bills, her mind racing to comprehend the generosity in front of her. It wasn't just a couple of dollars. It was enough to cover several months of medical expenses, maybe even more. She tried to find the words to express her gratitude, but they stuck in her throat, her emotions a tangled mess of shock, gratitude, and awe. Thank you, Mr. Musk, she managed to say, her voice trembling with emotion. You don't know how much this means to me. Elon smiled warmly, his face lighting up with a rare kind of kindness. No need to thank me. You're doing the real work here. I'm just helping out. Keep fighting, Emily. You've got this. With that, he gave her a gentle nod and turned, walking away down the street. As he disappeared from view, Emily stood there, holding the money in her hands, unable to fully grasp what had just happened. Her heart raced, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of hope ignite deep within her. In the days following Elon Musk's unexpected visit, Emily's lemonade stand became a local sensation. News of the billionaire's generous donation spread like wildfire through the neighborhood, and her small act of courage was quickly embraced by the community. People who had never noticed her before now stopped by her stand, eager to support her cause, not just out of sympathy but with a newfound sense of admiration. Many left with a cup of lemonade, a few dropping extra bills in the basket as they walked away, smiling at the brave little girl trying to save her own life. Some even came back again the next day, hoping to catch a glimpse of Emily or even meet her face to face. But as much as the attention made her feel special, it also stirred up emotions she hadn't expected. The kindness she had received from Elon, though still lingering in her heart, began to feel like an unexpected burden. With each passing day, her mother, Carla, who had once been her rock, seemed more distant, as if the glow of Elon's generosity had somehow cast a shadow over their relationship. Emily noticed the subtle changes in her mother's behavior. Carla would sit at the kitchen table more often, staring into space as though lost in thought. She rarely spoke about the bills anymore, as if the weight of them had suddenly become too much to bear. But it wasn't just the bills. Emily sensed an underlying tension, a quiet frustration that she couldn't quite name. Her mother's bright smile, the one that used to light up every room they entered, was starting to fade. Emily tried to talk to her, to ask if everything was okay, but Carla always brushed it off, telling her she was fine, just tired. The money from Elon had changed things, in ways Emily hadn't anticipated. While it had helped ease the immediate financial burden, it hadn't solved everything. The cost of her treatments was astronomical, and despite the generous donation, the bills were still piling up. Emily understood, but her mother, whose strength had always been a constant in her life, seemed to be growing weary. The weight of their situation was beginning to take its toll, and Emily's heart ached with the realization that no amount of lemonade could fix everything. In the midst of this, another shadow began to loom over their lives. An acquaintance of Carla's, Linda, who had always been a well-meaning but overbearing friend, began showing up at the house more frequently. She dropped by with food, trying to offer support, but there was always something about her presence that made Emily uneasy. Linda's smile never quite reached her eyes, and her compliments felt too rehearsed, too insincere. She would often gush about how proud she was of Emily, but there was a sharpness to her praise that made the young girl uncomfortable. Linda's interest in Emily's lemonade stand seemed to grow with each passing day. She would visit often, lingering longer than necessary, watching with a calculating gaze as Emily sold cup after cup of lemonade. Emily couldn't help but notice how Linda would always mention, almost offhandedly, that someone like Elon Musk could do so much more to help. At first, Emily thought it was just a casual remark, but the more Linda spoke about it, the more it felt like she was suggesting something more, something manipulative. One evening, after another exhausting day at the lemonade stand, Emily sat at the kitchen table, counting the small pile of bills she had earned. Her hands trembled as she organized the money, her mind wandering back to the conversation she'd overheard between her mother and Linda that afternoon. "I just don't understand why he hasn't done more," Linda had said. "I mean, it's clear she needs so much more. A little lemonade stand isn't going to cut it. Maybe he could do something bigger, something that would make more of an impact." Carla had been quiet at first, then sighed. "I don't know, Linda. I don't want to seem like we're asking for too much. He's already done more than enough." "Oh, don't be ridiculous," Linda snapped, her voice dripping with disdain. "If someone like him really cared, he'd step in. He has the resources, the power. But he won't. And you'll be stuck here, waiting for the next miracle that never comes." Emily couldn't shake the words. The insinuation that Elon Musk's donation was somehow insufficient, that it was only a small gesture, gnawed at her. Her chest tightened, the weight of the conversation pressing down on her. She hadn't realized how much her mother had been struggling with the expectations of others, and now, with Linda's influence hanging over them, the pressure was becoming unbearable. That night, as Carla tucked Emily into bed, the young girl spoke up. "Mom, do you think we're asking for too much?" Carla paused, her hand on the edge of the blanket. For a moment, she didn't speak, as if weighing her words carefully. Then, she sighed softly. "No, Emily, you're doing everything you can. You've already done more than most people ever would at your age. But sometimes people want more. They don't always understand." "Like Linda?" Emily asked, her voice small. Carla's lips tightened, and for a brief second, a flicker of something darker passed through her eyes. She quickly masked it with a smile. "No, sweetie. People like Linda, they want things to be different, and they think they know what's best. But don't listen to them. You're doing the right thing." But Emily wasn't so sure anymore. As the days passed, the tension between her mother and Linda grew. The subtle manipulations became more pronounced, and Emily began to see the cracks in her mother's resolve. Carla would no longer smile when she talked about the future. Instead, her gaze would drift away, her eyes clouded with doubt. The community, too, began to shift. People who had once supported Emily's lemonade stand with genuine kindness now began to treat her as a spectacle, a local attraction. They came not just to help, but to see the little girl with the big dream. Some were genuine, but others seemed more interested in telling her story to anyone who would listen. Emily started to feel like she wasn't a person anymore, just a story to be consumed. In this whirlwind of emotions and pressures, one thing became clear. Emily was no longer the only one fighting. Her mother was fighting too, fighting against her own doubts, fighting against the manipulations of people like Linda, and fighting against the ever-growing realization that the world was far more complicated than she had ever thought. The stakes had grown higher, and the closer they came to finding a solution, the more fragile their relationship became. It was only a matter of time before something would break. The heat of the summer had turned oppressive, the sun relentless in its golden assault as Emily sat behind her lemonade stand once again. The once charming little corner on Maple Street had become a familiar sight, but today it felt different. The world around her seemed to close in, and the weight of everything. The relentless pressure to raise more money, the constant expectations from people she didn't even know, and the slow unraveling of her mother's calm had settled deep in her chest. It felt suffocating, like the air was too thick to breathe. Emily tried to focus on her task, pouring lemonade from the pitcher into cup after cup, handing them out to the few customers who stopped by. The familiar sound of the ice clinking against the glass should have been comforting, but it only amplified the tension that was growing inside her. She glanced up occasionally, half expecting to see her mother, but Carla was nowhere in sight. For the past few days, her mother had become more withdrawn, her interactions with Emily distant, filled with moments of silence. Even when she was home, Carla seemed preoccupied, lost in her own thoughts. It wasn't long before Linda showed up again. She always seemed to know when things were at their breaking point. Today, her presence felt heavier than usual, a shadow that lingered as she approached the stand, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. She gave Emily a forced smile, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that cut through the afternoon's lazy stillness. "Hey there, sweetheart," Linda said. her voice dripping with sugary sweetness. "How's the stand going today?" Emily forced a smile, feeling the familiar discomfort stir within her. "It's okay," she replied, her voice flat. Linda leaned over the table, inspecting the lemonade like it was a product she was about to critique. "You know, you're doing great, but this isn't enough. Not nearly enough." She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing Emily's words. "You need something bigger, something that'll make people really pay attention. A bigger platform, more support." Emily's stomach churned. She didn't want to hear this, didn't want to feel the pressure to become some kind of spectacle. But Linda wasn't going to stop. "You need someone with real influence to step in. Elon Musk, he could be the one to save the day," Linda continued, leaning in closer, her breath too sharp in Emily's face. "But you need to make sure he knows that the clock's ticking, that you're not just some cute little charity case. You need to show him you're worth his time. Show him you mean business." The words hung in the air, sharp and insistent, like a buzzing fly that wouldn't leave. Emily looked away, trying to shake the feeling that Linda was pushing her too far. The desperation in Linda's voice felt like a pressure that was too much for someone like Emily to bear. And yet it wasn't the first time she had heard these suggestions. The community was starting to demand more, and she felt like she was drowning in their expectations. It wasn't long before Carla appeared, walking briskly down the street. She seemed agitated, her face flushed as she moved closer to the stand. Emily's heart sank. She had never seen her mother look so unsettled. Carla stopped next to the table, looking down at the money Emily had made for the day. The lines around her eyes deepened, and there was a tension in her jaw that Emily had never noticed before. "Mom," Emily asked, her voice small, "is everything okay?" Carla looked at her for a long moment, her eyes flickering with something that Emily couldn't quite place. There was a sudden sharpness in the way Carla reached for the money, as if she was trying to take control of something, anything. "We need to talk," Carla said quietly, her tone colder than usual. I don't think you're doing enough. This isn't enough." The words stung, sharper than any criticism Emily had ever heard. She blinked, her throat tightening. "But Mom, I've been trying." You need to understand," Carla interrupted, her voice rising, catching the attention of a few passers-by. "This isn't just some little lemonade stand, Emily. This is our only shot. If we don't do more, if we don't get someone like Musk to really notice, we're done." The words hit Emily like a physical blow. It was the first time her mother had ever spoken so bluntly about their situation. The desperation in her voice, the raw, exposed fear, sent a tremor of anxiety through Emily's body. Before she could respond, Linda stepped in, her presence like a dark cloud that overshadowed everything. "She's right, you know. You've got to do more. You can't just hope for a miracle. People like Elon Musk don't give second chances." Linda's tone was no longer soft. It was cold, matter-of-fact, and laced with something Emily couldn't quite identify. Carla's expression hardened at Linda's words, a flicker of agreement passing through her eyes before she masked it with a forced smile. "We'll figure it out, Emily. We'll make it work." But Emily didn't believe her. She could see it in her mother's face. There was no longer any hope in her eyes, only the crushing weight of reality. Carla was losing faith in the very thing that had kept them going. The belief that somehow they could make it through this, together. The conversation was interrupted by a loud shout, followed by the screech of tires skidding against the pavement. Emily's heart stopped. She turned just in time to see a dark sedan careen around the corner, its engine roaring as it barreled down the street. The car swerved, its tires screeching against the road as the driver lost control. "Get out of the way," a voice screamed. Before anyone could react, the car veered off course, heading straight for Emily's lemonade stand. Time seemed to slow as the world blurred around her. Her breath caught in her throat as she instinctively moved back, but there was no escape. The vehicle was too close, too fast. In the next instant, the car slammed into the table with a deafening crash, sending the pitcher of lemonade flying through the air and shattering against the pavement. Glass scattered in all directions, and the sound of the crash echoed in Emily's ears like an explosion. Her heart raced as she fell backward, landing hard against the sidewalk. The air was thick with the scent of lemon and gasoline, and the world around her spun in a chaotic blur. Everything was still for a moment. Then, there was movement. People were rushing toward the scene, shouting, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Emily lay on the ground, dazed and in shock, her body trembling from the impact. Her legs felt numb, and for a moment, she thought she might be dreaming. But the pain, the sharp sting in her side, told her otherwise. Carla was there in an instant, kneeling beside her, her hands shaking as she checked Emily for injuries. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with panic. "Emily, sweetheart, are you okay?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Emily's thoughts were a blur. The crash, the car, Linda's voice. It all collided in her mind, jumbled and confusing. But one thought stood out above the rest. Everything had just changed. The world wasn't waiting for them anymore. And neither was Elon Musk. Panic surged through Emily as she realized the full extent of what had just happened. The stand was destroyed. The dream she had fought for shattered in a moment of chaos. But more than that, she felt the weight of her mother's broken resolve settling over her like a suffocating blanket. Nothing would ever be the same again. As the crowd began to disperse and emergency vehicles arrived, Emily and her mother shared a look, one of understanding, one that spoke volumes without saying a word. The game had changed, and now they had to decide how far they were willing to go to survive it. The aftermath of the accident was like a wound that refused to heal. Emily spent the next few days in and out of the hospital, her body bruised but, thankfully, not seriously injured. Her mind, however, was another story. It churned with the chaotic events that had unfolded in the span of mere moments. The car crashing into her lemonade stand, the sound of shattering glass, her mother's frantic voice, and the overwhelming sense of loss that had descended over her life. The world she had known, the sense of purpose that her lemonade stand had given her, felt like it had been ripped away in an instant. In the hospital, Carla was there by her side every day, but there was a visible distance between them. The fear and worry in her mother's eyes were replaced by something more troubling, a deep exhaustion, a weariness that Emily had never seen before. Carla didn't speak much. She had always been a quiet person, but now she seemed lost in her thoughts, as if the weight of everything, the accident, the pressures they had faced, and the looming uncertainty of their future, had overwhelmed her. Emily felt like a spectator in her own life. Her mind kept replaying the crash over and over again, and every time it did, her stomach twisted. It wasn't just the accident. It was the moment before, the words that had been spoken, the pressure, the manipulation, the expectation, her mother's growing desperation, Linda's insistent suggestions. It had all led up to this point. And now, there was no going back. Outside the hospital room, the world had begun to react. The local community, which had once rallied behind Emily, was now divided. The lemonade stand had become a symbol, not of resilience, but of something more uncomfortable, of exploitation, manipulation, and broken dreams. News outlets, both local and national, had picked up the story, and soon, Emily's name was everywhere. Some praised her courage, others criticized her mother for using her daughter as a tool for attention. People were quick to point fingers, quick to form opinions, quick to forget the complexities that lay beneath the surface. Linda, once a familiar face in their lives, had disappeared in the wake of the accident. Emily hadn't seen her since that fateful day, but the damage had already been done. Linda's influence, her words that had fueled the fire of desperation in Carla, now seemed like a distant memory, but the echoes of her manipulation lingered. Emily's trust in people, especially adults, had been shattered. Her mother, the one person who had always been her rock, had allowed herself to be swayed by Linda's rhetoric, by the promise of a bigger, better solution. Emily could see the guilt in her mother's eyes, the regret that hung over her like a dark cloud, but it didn't change the fact that their lives had been irrevocably altered. Back at home, the reality of their situation began to sink in. The hospital bills piled up, and Carla found herself facing the same financial struggles that had plagued them before the lemonade stand. The donation from Elon Musk, though generous, hadn't been enough to cover the costs of Emily's treatment, and now, with the stand destroyed and Emily's health still fragile, the future seemed even more uncertain. Carla had tried to hold it all together, but the cracks were growing wider. She didn't know how to fix it anymore, how to keep pretending that everything would be okay. Emily watched her mother with a quiet sadness. The woman who had once seemed so strong, so sure of herself, was now a shell of the person she had been. Carla spent more time on the phone with doctors, hospital administrators, and social workers, trying to find ways to make ends meet. She was less present in Emily's life now, caught up in a whirlwind of paperwork and phone calls, her mind consumed by the endless barrage of problems that didn't have easy answers. And yet, even as the weight of everything threatened to crush them both, there were small moments of clarity. Moments when Emily would catch a glimpse of her mother's smile, brief but genuine, or when they would share a quiet conversation about something other than the bills or the illness. It was in those moments that Emily remembered why she had started the lemonade stand in the first place. Not for the attention, not for the donations, but because she wanted to do something for herself, to feel like she had control over something in a world that felt so out of control. She wanted to feel like she was making a difference, even if it was just a small one. But that dream was now clouded with guilt and uncertainty. Emily couldn't help but wonder if she had been complicit in the expectations that had led to the crash. Had she pushed her mother too hard? Had she let the pressure of success cloud her judgment? She didn't have the answers, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the line between right and wrong, between ambition and manipulation, was blurry. The community, too, had its own way of coping with the aftermath. People who had once cheered for Emily now seemed divided. Some continued to support her, offering kind words and donations in the hopes of helping her recover, while others turned their backs, disgusted by what they saw as the exploitation of a child for personal gain. It wasn't just the accident that had soured the perception of the lemonade stand. It was the narrative that had formed around it, one that painted Emily's mother as someone who had used her daughter's illness as a means to an end. The truth was more complicated than that, but the public rarely cared for the complexities of reality. They wanted a simple story, a hero, a villain, and a clear resolution. And that wasn't what they got. Carla tried to ignore the whispers, the stares, the judgment that came from every direction, but it was impossible. Every time she stepped outside, she could feel the weight of the eyes on her, the silent accusations that hung in the air. She had never been one for confrontation, but now it seemed unavoidable. She had become the subject of gossip, the focus of disapproval, and she couldn't escape it. Emily could see the strain in her mother's eyes, the way her shoulders slumped, as if the very act of existing in the world had become too much. And then there was the legal fallout. The driver of the car, a young man who had been speeding, was quickly identified, and the incident was investigated. The authorities didn't believe there was any malicious intent, but the driver still faced charges for reckless driving, and his insurance would cover the damages. Yet, for Carla and Emily, it didn't feel like a victory. The crash had cost them more than just money. It had cost them their sense of security, their trust in the world, and their relationship with each other. In the quiet aftermath of the chaos, Emily couldn't help but wonder where they went wrong. She had been so focused on the future, on the dream of raising enough money, of being someone who could make a difference. But in the end, it wasn't the money that mattered. It was the connection they had to each other, the bond that had been tested and strained by the pressure of it all. Now, as Emily lay in bed, her mother sitting quietly beside her, the weight of everything pressed down on them both. Neither of them had the answers. They didn't know what the future would hold or how they would move forward from here. But as they sat in the silence, Emily realized that they would have to face it together, no matter how fractured their lives had become. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The weeks following the accident unfolded slowly, like a slow, unraveling thread, each day bringing with it a new layer of emotion, consequence, and change. Emily's body healed more quickly than her heart. The bruises on her legs faded, but the emotional scars, the quiet guilt that gnawed at her, the overwhelming sense of lost opportunity, lingered. Her mother, Carla, too, carried a weight that wasn't visible but felt in every word, every interaction. The public scrutiny, the whispered judgments, and the harsh glare of society's spotlight had shifted the course of their lives in ways they never expected. In the months after the accident, Carla continued to work tirelessly to support Emily's treatment, but it wasn't the same. The hope she had once held in the success of their project had faded into a quiet resignation. There were no more grand plans, no more attempts to make it big. Instead, Carla focused on the small victories, the moments when Emily smiled, the rare times when she felt like things were getting better. She no longer worried about what the world thought of her, at least not as much. The pressure, though still there, was different now. It was quieter, more internal. The legal issues surrounding the accident were resolved quickly. The driver, who had been speeding at the time, was found to be at fault, but his insurance covered the damages to the stand. The public outrage that had followed in the immediate aftermath subsided as time went on. Emily's name, once trending in every local news outlet, faded from the headlines. There were no more offers from influential figures, no more promises of celebrity endorsements. The world moved on, as it always does, to the next story, the next tragedy, the next cause. But for Emily and Carla, the story didn't end there. The loss they felt wasn't just about the lemonade stand. It was about something deeper. Their lives, like the shattered glass of the stand, could never be put back together in the same way. And yet, there was a strange sense of peace that began to settle over them in the quiet moments of reflection. They didn't need the world to see them as heroes or victims. What mattered, what truly mattered, was that they were together, that they had each other in the aftermath of it all. Elon Musk's donation, though significant, became a distant memory. There was no grand public acknowledgement of it, no viral moment where the world marveled at his generosity. Instead, it was a quiet transaction. His team had reached out to make sure Emily's treatment was covered, and that was enough. In the grand scheme of things, it was just another act of kindness in a world that was filled with them, if people chose to look for them. Emily had learned something in the months following the crash, something that wasn't easy to grasp, but something that felt true. The world didn't owe her anything, nor did it owe her mother anything. The expectations that had been placed on them by society, by strangers who thought they knew their story, weren't theirs to carry anymore. It was a sobering realization, but one that gave Emily a new kind of strength. She no longer saw herself as a symbol, a cause, or an underdog. She was just a girl, trying to figure out how to live her life in a world that didn't always make sense. Carla, too, found her own kind of redemption in the quiet moments. She no longer tried to chase after something bigger, something more. The desire to prove herself, to make her daughter's illness a rallying cry, had faded, leaving space for something more genuine. A desire to heal, to move forward, and to accept the imperfections that came with being human. It wasn't easy, but it was honest. And that was enough for now. As for the community, time healed the wounds that had opened so quickly. Some people still held grudges, still whispered about the way things had played out. But there were others who quietly offered support in their own way. The human tendency to judge, to point fingers, gave way to a more understanding, compassionate approach. People saw Carla and Emily for who they were. Not as symbols of success or failure, but as individuals who had been through something difficult and who were trying to navigate the complexities of life. The story of the lemonade stand, with all its hopes and disappointments, became a lesson that extended beyond the lives of Emily and Carla. It served as a reminder that the road to success is rarely straight. The pursuit of fame, fortune, or validation often blinds people to what truly matters. The relationships they hold dear, the kindness they offer, and the simple joys of being alive. The desire to be seen, to be recognized, can cloud one's judgment and make them lose sight of the things that bring true happiness. It's easy to look at a story like Emily's and see it through the lens of external success. An attempt to raise money for a noble cause, a viral sensation, a meeting with a famous billionaire. But the deeper truth, the one that Emily and her mother had come to understand, was that success wasn't measured by how many people saw you or how much money you made. It was about finding peace with who you were, understanding that mistakes were part of life, and realizing that the people who mattered most were the ones who stuck with you through it all, not the ones who cheered from the sidelines. As Emily sat on the porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she found herself lost in thought. The pain of the past still lingered, but it wasn't as sharp as it had been. The scars were there, yes, but they had become a part of her story. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. She wasn't a charity case. She wasn't a victim of circumstance. She was just a girl, finding her way in a world that didn't always make sense. And as she reflected on everything that had happened, on all the things she had learned and unlearned, she realized that the true power didn't lie in the money or the attention or even in the grand gestures. It lay in the quiet moments of introspection, in the way she had learned to forgive herself, in the way she had learned to see her mother not as a source of disappointment, but as a fellow traveler on the road of life. They were both broken, yes, but in that brokenness, they had found something real, a bond that could withstand anything the world threw their way. So, as the story of the lemonade stand came to an end, Emily and Carla faced the future with a renewed sense of purpose, not because of the things they had lost, but because of what they had gained. The understanding that life was messy, unpredictable, and often painful, but that there was beauty in the mess. And in that beauty, they had found a way to move forward. As always, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more heartfelt tales like this one. Your support means the world.